question, can you tell me about a time or a situation when you felt loved? So as much as they tried, people couldn't think of situations. So that then brought to the surface all the painful feelings that were connected to them knowing and painfully being aware that they couldn't think of a situation where they had received love. And it was painful to witness, and because they found it so painful.
Hello, and welcome to Locked Up Living, the podcast which looks at resilience in challenging organisations, such as, but not only, prisons and hospitals for mentally ill prisoners and patients. My name is David Jones, and together with Naomi Murphy, I present your Locked Up Living podcast.
So really delighted to welcome along today Christina Straub. Christina's vocation is centred around qualitative social research, and in particular research in prisons. She graduated with an MA as a cultural scientist in Germany in 2009 with an ethnographic study about the construction of individual identity in the car subculture of hot rodding. Her first postgraduate employment as a research assistant for the prisons was at the Prisons Research Centre at the Institute of Criminology at Cambridge University, which led her into a high-secure prison exploring staff-prisoner relationships together with Professor Alison Liebling and Helen Arnold. The many stories and layers of the prison environment ever since continue to play a major role in her work. It included, for example, qualitative research for the London-based charity The Forgiveness Project, looking into the specific pains and needs of families of people serving an indeterminate sentence for public protection, together with Dr Harry Annison in collaboration with the Prison Reform Trust. Currently, Christina works with Dr Kate O Brien at Durham University on a project evaluating the early days in custody programme. Today we've invited Christina along to discuss her research-based book, Love as Human Virtue and Human Need, and its role in the lives of long-term prisoners. Christina, your book's such a powerful read, and it's unusual, I think, to see so many rich, detailed accounts of people's real lives, that I feel really strongly that it should be read by anyone who's interested in the causes and treatment of factors that underpin offending or that lead to long-term hospitalisation, because I think they share some commonalities in terms of the themes of your work. So absolutely delighted that we've had the chance to have this conversation today.
Thank you.
Yes, hello Christine. I'll echo what Naomi has said about your book. I think it's a beautifully written book, and it's full of, well, it's a very erudite book, and the references cover a very wide ground. It's full of interest for anyone to read, actually. But Christina, you've been involved in various projects related to the criminal justice system. How did you come to the decision that you would focus your research on love?
Well, I fell into it, basically. So I've come from a cultural sciences background, and I graduated in 2009. And after that, I was looking for jobs, and I came across a job description from Cambridge University, who were looking for a researcher to conduct research in a high security prison. So I've never worked in a prison before. And so... well, long story short, I got the job, and we went into this high security prison, and one of my interviewees there said something that will forever echo in my ear. He said something along the lines of, there's no love in the concrete. Sometimes you feel as if even the walls despise you. And so that really got me thinking. And as a novice, a total novice, I mean, other people have talked about this as well, and I think one of Ben Crew's interviewees said something similar. So it's not like a one-off, and it kind of triggered in me this kind of, so why is that? Because I couldn't make sense of it, because for me, as a total outsider coming into that field and into that environment, it was kind of a no-brainer that there must be some love somewhere, but it was such a curious omission of that topic, of that word, that I basically was like, well, if no one's talking about it, I'm going to talk about it. So if everybody's so uncomfortable about it, let's see what's behind that. So that was the initial motivation, and then it took a few more years until it fully developed into a research proposal for a PhD. And before I knew what kind of areas I wanted to cover, but that was the initial motivation behind it. And then it took on a life of its own, basically.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So at that initial stage, which is a beautiful quote, of course, there's no love in the concrete. But at that initial stage, did you pick up anything about fear and anxiety?
Definitely, I think fear and anxiety of everybody in that particular prison to even go there, because there was such a high fear of conditioning, and vulnerable emotions like love were so connected to being, for staff to being conditioned or to show any kind of emotions for people serving a sentence in that prison, to be taken advantage of or to fall victim of exploitation. So there was a lot of anxiety around vulnerable emotions, but especially around that love, that word love. So it was the word itself that was so laden with some sort of meaning that I couldn't understand, and that therefore I wanted to understand why that was.
Yeah. So your book includes a nice description of some of the barriers to conducting research in prisons. And do you think you faced any extra barriers in getting your research up and running because of its focus? Because it seems quite a brave choice of subject matter, because, as we were just saying, in prisons the concept of love tends to be equated with anxiety and with sex.
Yes, it was. Little did I know that I entered into like a highly political field, and I came from it from quite a naive stance of, oh, I want to know what's behind it, so I'm going to go and research it, and I wasn't ready to not only. I think I faced more more anxiety from, let's say, the university side of things, because there was a time limit to my research. I was totally dependent on the access from NOMS. Back in the days it was still NOMS, and so I think even my supervisors were very uncomfortable with the topic. But I think you also need to be lucky in life. So I was really lucky that at that time Alison pointed me towards someone who was overseeing the area of the Northwest in the prison service. And he pointed me towards a governor that he thought would understand what I meant by my research and would be open to it. So I got in touch with that governor, and we hit it off immediately. So it was a female governor. She was very open to my topic, and I had a conversation with her describing what I wanted to look at, so that she knew what I wanted to look at, and from then on I think it went pretty smoothly, surprisingly. But I think it was more like that. It was assumed that it would be a huge hindrance, and due to luck and to knowing how to market my research, it was then smoother than expected.
Do you think the fact that it was a female governor you were talking to made any difference?
I think it depends on the person, because since then I have, or before that, I have encountered also male prison governors or senior managers that got me, that got what I wanted to look at. And I would say it depends on the person and their level of open-mindedness.
I was thinking you were very lucky, and I agree with you in terms of the sex of the governor is probably irrelevant, because I've had conversations with female governors who've referred to having discussions of love as dangerous. That was their choice of word, and also worked with lots of male officers who've been able to discuss the concept of love very easily in a very in the broadest sense of the word, and to understand that that one isn't talking about sex or romantic love, but is talking about love in a much broader sense. And it's I think there's something about the maturity of individuals to be able to hold those conversations.
Yeah, thank you. So, but moving on, Christina, your book includes a nice literature review of explorations of love, and in particular a summary of its evolutionary purpose or functions. Can you talk us through those a bit?
Yes, so I made a point of looking at disciplines that I deemed to tell us more about us as human beings, so what we need and how we function well. So who are we as human beings? That's always been like one of my big questions. So I looked at neurosciences, and I looked at sociology, I looked at psychology and moral philosophy, and that exploration can only ever be incomplete. So I only scratched the surface in that, and I had to stop at some point, reading books and finding articles. So my definition, or what I have found, I don't claim it to be the be all and end all. So, but yeah. So what I found from the, I have to refer to my book actually. What I found from, for example, from neurosciences is that it's like it caters love is a human need, and psychology also has a similar approach, and it's kind of centered in the limbic part of our brains, and this, according to neurosciences, some people might disagree, and maybe some other research will find different things. But the research I've read said that this part of our brain evolved as a means to connect to other mammals, to other human beings. So we constantly tune into each other. It's like a social organ, and love, in that sense, plays a big part in human beings like relating to each other peacefully and in a social way, and to not kill each other, not beat each other up, and it's a necessary, like, love is a necessary prerequisite to regulate our nervous system, so to have mental equilibrium, and it is essential for psychological well-being, development, and growth. And so as much as the provision of love is very important, the absence of love is then becomes even more important, because as a result of prolonged love deprivation, an uncontrollable stress response can be induced in our brains, and that could lead to a destabilization of brain circuitry. I hope I pronounced this right. And as well as dysfunctional or pathological coping mechanisms. So the provision of love is like a coin with two sides, love. So the need provision is crucial, and so the deprivation becomes even more crucial. So and so it's kind of it's anchored in, like, connection, human connection, like the sensory connection, the connection between the newborn and the body of the mother or the father. So to have this kind of connection, this regulation that keeps us healthy, so mentally healthy. And so if that equilibrium gets out of kilter too much, our nervous systems can't cope properly, and that's when pathologies can develop.
So from what you're saying, that must be particularly important for children, and the absence of love for children must have a profound effect, would you say?
Yes, according to, like, neurosciences studies, it is because the brain develops already in the womb, and then until the age of 7. It's basically the programming stage. So anything, because the brain then, it's an open circuitry still. So all the connections are formed, the basic, most dominant connections in the brain are formed throughout the stages like 0 to 7. So whatever happens throughout childhood has such a profound effect later in life, because it's mainly like programming a computer. So you have that. I don't want to say that humans are computers, but to have like an analogy. So it's very important what happens throughout those first 7 years, because it has immense effects on the whole life afterwards.
Thank you.
One of the things that's striking about your book, Christina, is the number of accounts of people's experiences of lack of love very early on in life, which are really familiar to me and David in terms of our experience of working with people. And I think certainly my experience of working within different levels of security is the more secure, the higher the level of security of the establishment, the more brutal the upbringing and the less love that was present in their childhoods. Is it fair for us to behave punitively towards those whose actions might be directly related to an absence of love early in life, do you think?
Well, I think, James Gilligan has done a lot of work on that, the relationship between punishment and violence. And there is a really good book called From Pain to Violence by Felicity de Zulueta, who also elaborates on that. But I think if we kind of look at how our brains function and that we mirror each other, so what we put out is reflected back. So from a lay point of view, I'm not a neuroscientist by any means, but knowing what I've read so far, I would think that if we punish someone who's never or rarely experienced anything different, that you will get a negative result back. And so love is seen as something like a positivity resonance. So in the same sense, if we kind of put something positive out towards another person, it's more likely that this will register in the brain and kind of create like a reverberance. Whereas the more punishment, the more violence, it is like creates like a vicious cycle. It's kind of an ongoing cycle. Whereas why not try something a bit more positive and see how it goes?
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the other things that was really noticeable working in the high secure prison estate was the degree to which hatred was a currency in a way that it wasn't within medium secure and low secure settings. And when talking to the men about their experiences of childhood, it was fairly typical for them to have had the experience that their parents not only didn't love them but actually hated them and wanted them dead. And that was quite a striking difference between the men there and the men in other settings, I think. But moving on, you refer to the 4 interpretations of love found within the literature, and I wondered if you could talk us through those for the listeners.
I went to Plato, the go-to moral philosopher of choice, and in his that work of the Symposium, he denominates as love as one of the highest virtues, as the ones that a moral agent can express. And the moral philosophers of the Greek era, especially, they define eros, which we probably most refer to when we talk about love, but it's only one of 4 different definitions. So eros is most commonly referred to as a type of desire, driving people to connect sexually and also to think obsessively of the person who is loved. And then philia, in comparison, is most likely referred to when we look at friendship, something that is more of a companionship. It has been described as the easiest and the most sustainable of love by moral philosophers. It loves something about the person for him or herself, for the friend's sake, and wants good for the friend's sake itself without reciprocity. And that is also similar to agape, the love of mankind. It loves something, the definition goes that it loves something in a person that cannot easily be loved. So in that sense, it's kind of not as equal as the love of philia, for example, where where you look at equals. And then there is Storge, the familial love that we would probably refer to as the love, the attachment between mother and child, mother, father, child, or families in that sense. So there's a whole range of different kinds of love, and I think in our society, that's changing as well, because it's always a matter of what time we're in, what kind of society we're in. But I think in the Western world, love has come to be associated mostly with eros, mostly with the romantic concept of love. This that has become popular in I think it was the 19th-20th century, and it's still kind of dominant in our way to look at love. So it's most popular, but there are other kinds, and I think it's unfair to put all the weight on eros without considering all the other important kinds of love that can make our lives more fulfilled.
I think that's right, and I think because of the inference that love is always going to be about sex and desire, I think when we would speak about love within the unit, and the staff working within the unit and the people who lived in the unit all knew that we were talking about love in the broadest sense of the word, in the sense of agape and compassion. But when we would speak about it with outsiders, we would try and make sure that we always spoke about agape, because that we knew that it would be hard for people to comprehend otherwise, because of all of the inferences that come with talking about love, really. How are you defining love for the purpose of your... Sorry, yes.
Yeah, sorry, I was just thinking that it's kind of quite dangerous as well to never talk about sex and sexual relationships, because it's highly prevalent in relationships between partners, domestic violence and stuff that develops out of dysfunctional or not very loving patterns to relate to one's partner. So it is a big omission to not really have that as a topic in a sense, because it then becomes taboo and goes underground, and it doesn't really lend itself to any sort of honest exploration.
But I think people are terrified of it because in the moment, eros is the most powerful and destabilizing of the four. So whilst it has this kind of capacity to bring tremendous closeness and ecstasy, it also, flipping over, brings potential destruction. Sorry, what were you going to say?
Well, I was just thinking, so eros would get spoken about, but that was something that would be very frightening to go into in terms of people's feelings about staff in that. So if we were talking about relationships between the therapeutic relationship between, even now having to add the qualifier of a therapeutic relationship between a staff and prisoner, that actually there would be explorations of loving compassion, and of course sexual feelings do emerge within they emerge within all therapeutic settings, but it's hard to have those conversations when people are not aware that that is a natural part of human relating, and it's important to be able to talk about it. And I think what often happens in prison is that sex only gets spoken about when it's being discussed within the context of deviancy, and it's like if you're in prison because you've committed a sexual offence, it's almost as if you have no right to have healthy, ordinary sexual feelings, that any conversation you have about sexual feelings is likely to be viewed through the prism of deviancy at the same time. So very scary subjects.
Yes, and in the same, I might become very unpopular now, but it seems to be very much a geographical, cultural phenomenon, because I'm German by background, and in German prisons it's a very common thing to have conjugal visits and to not deprive people serving a prison sentence of that need. So it's I think if you look to other jurisdictions, it could be approached differently. So it's and And I'm always a big fan of talking about things rather than letting them go underground and fester, because they don't go away. They're still there. It's just not spoken about, but it still happens.
But I was thinking the issue of conjugal visits is, I think, slightly different, because I think the British regard that as a privilege, and you can't associate such a privilege with people being punished in prison.
So how did you come to choose your participants, Christina, and did you find it easy to get people to have these conversations with you?
At the point of my fieldwork, that particular prison was very, well, let's say, not in good shape. So there was a lot of staff shortages, a lot of spice in that particular prison. So recruiting my participants was more of hit and miss, I have to say. So because I had focused on long-term people who were serving a long-term prison sentence, that was one that narrowed my choices in that regard. And then also I had to just get who I could to put it bluntly. But once I was and also I talked to people beforehand asking, well, I distributed information leaflets, or a senior manager did that for me before I started fieldwork. That was really kind and very nice from the prison staff, who helped me a lot. Just asking people if they were comfortable talking about this topic. Also, I had to consider the well-being of my participants. Someone might have suffered a recent bereavement of a loved one, or had problems with their partners, or something like that. So I had to take that into consideration. And then after that, it was fairly smooth in regards to people wanting to talk about it. And I got a lot of emotional accounts, actually. I had tears, I had laughter. It was quite less of a taboo than the general anxiety around it is created. So once we had that conversation, it was actually quite natural, I would say.
Which might say something about how essential it is in people's lives that people wanted to talk about that, even though you didn't have the chance to build up a more emotionally intimate relationship between you, that you just had to go for it. Might say something about how pressing it was for them. What were your findings? What was the outcome of your interviews?
In a nutshell, I would say love matters. So love still matters. It mattered in their past lives. It still matters in their current lives, and it will continue to matter in the future. So it is worth having a conversation about. And there are so many different accounts of love, and what was striking is that although it is such an abstract concept, and it is almost impossible to come up with a definition of what love is, because there are so many points of views and so many different cultural approaches. But for my participants, they knew when it is there, and they knew when it is not there. So as much as it is difficult to really put the finger on what it is and how it works, but you feel it. So and participants felt it.
A number of your participants felt like they'd never experienced love at all. Were you expecting this, and what was it like to hear it?
I wasn't expecting it, because I didn't put a question like that in the questionnaire. So, and that those responses emerged from the question, predominantly from the question, can you tell me about a time or a situation when you felt loved? So, as much as they tried, people couldn't think of situations. So that then brought to the surface all the painful feelings that were connected to them knowing and painfully being aware that they couldn't think of a situation where they had received love. And it was painful to witness, and because they found it so painful. And but sometimes there was also the opportunity to then move towards a different kind of love than only the storge, the familial love, or eros, that love. Because some people were able to remember having a beloved pet. Some people remember talking to their cat when they were locked up in their rooms as a child, or someone having a dog. That was the only time they experienced love. And whenever they were able to access those memories or those feelings, it was like a noticeable shift in their facial expressions, and it lighted up their lives to like that situation when one participant was then telling me about his relationships with his grandma. So he told in very vivid detail how his grandma would make him feel loved, and the little comforts that she would give him, making a little hot drink before bed. And so that was also very important to understand the little avenues of love away from the main roads of love.
That's very interesting. I mean, I can certainly remember feeling that our dog was the only thing in the world that really loved me at one time, but I was fortunate enough in that I also had parents. So for those who couldn't recollect experiencing love from somebody very close, like a parent, what do you think was the effect upon them?
I think being lost in life, like feeling lost, perceiving the world to be an unsafe place. Like, because as they said, if you cannot trust your mother, if you cannot trust those who are supposed to love you, who can you trust? So it created like a profound feeling of feeling unsafe in the world, not trusting anyone, and being very closed off to any sort of vulnerability, to any sort of relationships. So it was profound in a way that relating to the world was very, very guarded.
Yes, it's a very powerful phrase, feeling lost to the world.
I think a lot of people in prison have, experience things that would be associated with feeling empty inside. So use of substances, or attracting a label of borderline personality disorder, for instance, which again is associated with that feeling empty. And there's a really nice quote from Internal Family Systems that adults who feel empty are full of all the child's loss of love during childhood, and which I think really speaks of that experience, that it's something that we carry with us into adulthood if we don't have that sense of love.
And whenever I think that, almost for people I spoke to, it was almost easier to feel empty than to experience the pain, but it was only buried quite close to the surface, and a lot of people described how they would try to numb that pain with, as you said, Naomi, with substances, or with cutting it off. So it was almost easier to feel empty, to not have to feel anything, than to go there and experience that pain, because it was not an environment to do so.
So given that love has such a central part in our lives, why do you think it's been so neglected in the wider criminal justice system?
Yes, that's a very, very good question. And as much as I kind of wanted to understand why that is, I don't think I'm much wiser. It's like, I think there's a conversation to be had from practitioners, from those in politics, from those who run institutions, and it's kind of almost a paradigm that it's like an ideology almost, to not associate this particular institution at prison with love when it deals with people. So in other institutions like education, like school or hospitals, the ethics is a different one. So I also write about it in my book, like that the ethics of care is much less questioned when it comes to health environments, although that is kind of not a given anymore. When the ethics of economics has taken over such a huge part. So I think it's a mix of an ideology, whereas it would be very inconvenient to open that can of worms because it would require a lot of changes and a lot of questioning and a lot of concessions, and so that would mean a lot of work, I suppose. But that's a guess. So I'm open to contributions. I'm open to discussions with anyone in the criminal justice system, she says.
Well, I noticed that one of the quotes in your book suggests that policy influence for social research is quite possibly a chimera. You quoted Bloor in saying that. But you also say that one of the purposes in writing the book was to spread the word, really. So given that, what do you think the prison service could do to help prisoners access the healing and nourishing properties of love?
Oh, that's a big question. So, where to start? I think you could start with the architecture of the prison environment, how it is, because everything is geared towards the underlying motivation of punishment. So that would have to change, and then the rest would have to follow, in a sense that once a different paradigm is kind of adopted, and even if it's to help those serving prison sentences to not die whilst they are incarcerated. So that is a main motivation, because still there are a significant number of people serving a prison sentence take their own lives. They self-harm. They still are violent towards themselves or towards others. So I think it's not even an exaggeration to understand how to love yourself, to give those who are serving a prison sentence the means to, for example, self-regulate, to understand their emotions, to know what they've experienced and who they are now is kind of a logical consequence in some ways. I'm not saying take responsibility away from everyone, because that would not be loving. It's kind of to speak the truth, to be able to say these are my weaknesses, these are my strengths, to have a bit of a more balanced view of a human being. I mean, everybody who's probably tried to give up smoking or to make other changes in life knows how hard it is. And so if we talk about rehabilitation, I think it's an omission to not include human needs and at the same time human virtues. It's like the weaknesses and the strengths, to have a holistic image of a human being. So I think it's just part of it, and it's also a bit of a pragmatic approach. I think it's not even a sentimental approach to say, oh, this is missing and this is our moral obligation, but to say, all right, we're human beings. What do we need to lead a good life, to have a balanced mental health, and so to view it in a bit of a more pragmatic way, and to start talking honestly about that, to see what can we learn from other disciplines, to to see what neurosciences has found, psychology, sociology, cultural sciences, moral philosophy. So to look what makes us human, and what are we doing, to put it bluntly.
So do you think the treatments available in the criminal justice system, in prisons and secure hospitals, might be different if staff were more mindful of the human need for love? So I was thinking specifically about your reference to Lewis's work, that in some important ways people cannot be stable on their own.
Yes, I think if we take it from neurosciences, for example, without saying that's the only discipline looking into that, but from what I have learned from Lewis's work is that we influence each other. Our brains influence each other. We're like little radio stations picking up signals from other people. So it's important how we relate, how we talk to each other, how we meet each other, and what kind of relationships seem to be safe, and while others don't seem to be safe. So that does a lot to our nervous system, and whether we feel stressed or relaxed. And I think there's a neuroscientist called Hüter who also researches love, and he says that the best kind of condition for new neurological pathways to emerge is feeling safe, is feeling loved, is having that sort of environment where you could flourish. Or Maslow also looks at it, this kind of self-realization. So staff also need to feel safe, in a sense. So the prison environment is feels so unsafe that it is almost impossible, I would think, to create those relationships that can emerge in a safe environment, in like when there is time and space, privacy, relative safety, intimacy, like probably most in therapeutic relationships. And so if this could be implemented also with staff and prisoners, but that would mean that the whole environment has to change, like to provide some safe spaces, and that is currently not the case, because the environment itself is so kind of volatile and so unsafe for most people who have to work there, have to live there, go there day in and day out. So I think there would be a whole plethora of things that would have to follow if the paradigm would shift only slightly towards a more enabling approach, towards a more like creating safety, creating feelings of connection. And so that is kind of a big ask, really. But I think staff themselves need to feel valued, and also need to feel that their needs have been taken into consideration. And I think it's not fair to throw human beings into an environment with, what is it currently, 6 weeks training, 7 weeks training, and to not kind of give them the tools to understand what's going on. I think it's very unfair towards the staff that would love to do a good job, as you want to do a good job if you start it. So I think the valuing of the staff need to change, and the valuing then could be, in an ideal world, maybe then would reverberate to the people they work with. If that answered your question at all.
Yes, and there was a report yesterday out, wasn't there, where there was a criticism of the number of prisoners who are held within CSEs, and so the prison service was under criticism for holding men in these conditions. But I think people to some degree, engineer to get themselves into CSCs because they're frightened. So they present as dangerous in order to protect themselves, in order to not to feel frightened. And in some ways, as a society, we hold responsibility because on the one hand, we criticise the prison service for having people kept in isolation, which is obviously an awful condition to be kept under. But equally, I think it's very hard for prisons to do something that's more compassionate because the red tops like to criticise and talk about the people who are incarcerated as monsters. So in some ways, it's the prison service is stuck in this position of not being able to move towards a more compassionate approach. I was saying that in some ways we have a responsibility as society. We each individual bears some burden because people buy the red tops which are talking about these monsters in prison, which is kind of incompatible with treating people in a more compassionate, loving way, and which would enable prisons to be safer, kinder places.
Yes, and I think that's the thing. That's a really good thing that you mentioned that because this kind of societal love that has been already picked up by a lot of feminist literature. They talk about how society should has kind of as you say a moral, not obligation, but an ethics of love towards its members, and so that it should not all be left to the parents or to the schools, but that it could an atmosphere, an attitude of love would have to be fostered between members of society, and that would move significantly away from current ideologies of gains and economically motivated policies and ideologies. So to value instead of using other people. So that where do you start really? It's kind of the discussion would have to be had of how well we're doing as a society. Are we doing well? Are we healthy? How many people don't survive? It's not just. It's brutal. It takes a brutal look at ourselves and see what are we doing? Are we living virtuous lives in the way that we look at others' well-being, or what is going well, what's not going so well? So I think a lot of discussion, not only between academics, but between practitioners and those in higher places, and us as individuals would have to kind of start in that sense. It's already going on, and there's a lot of good work already going on. It's just that, yeah, it's hard to say where to start, really.
Well, at the moment we're struggling to find sympathy for people who are floating in the middle of the English Channel, let alone prisoners, and we're in a difficult political time, I think. Okay. Well, I think probably now is the time to think about where you are in all this, because your book is full of very moving material, and some of this is deeply poignant and uplifting. Others feel really sad and tragic, and I'm wondering how you coped with being steeped in such painful material, and how you looked after your own well-being.
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's something that has evolved, I would say, throughout my when I first started to conduct research in a prison environment, and throughout that time I have developed some strategies that I always have to follow. And for one though, when I talk to people about these painful experiences, the highs and lows of their lives, I don't feel kind of weighed down by it at all. in that sense. I feel privileged that people share this with me, and I love stories. So it's like, you tell me your story, I love that. So it's but it's I can't really deny that they stay with me. So in the first job I had in a prison, that was a lot more the case, because it was my first encounter with those stories, growing up in a probably relatively protected environment. I was quite lucky. Those stories were new to me, and I think I was a bit shell shocked. I was like, wow, that's all going on. Where was I living? And it was good though, because I had a bit of an existential crisis, and my little bubble burst with a loud bang. It's like, yeah, okay, that's all going on. Okay, there's a lot of that going on. So what's going on? And so these stories, as much as they are enriching, and I feel privileged, I have to take care of my own well-being by taking care of my mental well-being. So yoga is my go-to strategy. Taking walks in nature, talking to friends, going like to pre-COVID, going to pubs, have a bit of a rant now and then, without divulging any information, obviously, about the research or any information of that. And music, dancing in my room, also talking to people who get me. So a lot of people don't get it, and if there's something that is painful, then to try and get understanding from people who have a vastly different opinion is not very helpful. But luckily in the research community, there are a lot of people who get where I'm coming from, and who get where I struggle. And I also have a go-to that's a bit embarrassing. I call it chamomile TV. So it's watching things like Gone Fishing. Gone Fishing is my go-to chamomile TV. Something that's soothing and not too heavy. The Big Bang Theory, the Great British Bake Off. So profane things, and then a lot of mindfulness. So a lot of mindfulness. I binge watch Eckhart Tolle, and try to put some perspective on what I'm hearing, and also to apply my love of learning. So what can I learn from these stories? What can I take away? And when I do research in a prison environment, I always make sure that I value the contributions of my participants. So before I leave, I say goodbye, and if once it was around Christmas time, so I distributed Christmas cards saying thank you, and valuing the contribution, and valuing the person, really, because it's not I don't take it for granted that people open their hearts and talk about all these painful things, and then just go, yeah, thank you, bye. So that's just not how I do it. So, but it's imperative to take care of my own well-being, self-love. I would call it self-love, but I had to learn that over the years.
So you've got a terrific range of strategies there, Christina. I admire you. I noticed it didn't include hot rodding, but perhaps that was only a kind of temporary interest.
Yeah, that's too expensive. That's too expensive. I can't afford that. And also, I've now become an avid cyclist, so I changed my loyalties.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. That's a very full and kind of dense, really, discussion that we've had, covering a lot of ground. Thank you very much indeed for that.
You also asked me if I had, thank you as well, you also asked me if I had any inspirational material. Do you want me to share this now, or send you links or something? Things that inspire me.
Tell us now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Tell us now.
So I've got All About Love by Bell Hooks, a big feminist scholar, which writes beautifully about love. And there is also a documentary called The Work.
Oh yes, that's brilliant.
That is about Do you know it?
Yes, it's so moving.
The work, that documentary. Then there is, yes, and it's so powerful. It's like, wow, that is all. We're not so different after all. You know, we all have pains and struggles and victories. So then there is a program called Success Stories, and that is about teaching feminism in male prison establishments. And there is a documentary called The Feminist on Cell Block Y that's really good. And I find the work of James Gilligan quite inspirational, and Martin Luther King, basically everything by Martin Luther King. So that's my inspirational people and works.
Well, that's quite a pantheon, actually, so thanks for that. Yeah.
Thank you so much for today, Christina. It's been a great conversation. I'm sorry my Wi-Fi kept dropping out.
So that was a great recording with Christina, and we managed to struggle through, even though we had some technical difficulties. But interestingly enough, those seem to parallel what Christina was saying about her own experience doing the research, that she really had to use all of her skill and resourcefulness to gather the candidates for her research, and of course negotiating with various personnel as well. So I thought that was really interesting, the way that kind of fitted in. But then the other side of that was the experience that she described of listening to the pain of people recalling how they had never felt loved, and I thought that was really poignant.
Yeah, I was really disappointed my Wi-Fi stopped me participating at points, but absolutely. And, you know, sitting in groups, hearing men say that this is the first time that I felt loved, and you think there's something desperately heartbreaking about people getting to their mid-40s and being in an institution, and a punitive institution, to experience that. You know, it's heartbreaking. And how can we expect people to heal and grow if talking about love is something that's taboo and off the table?
Yeah, that's so important. Many thanks again to all of you who have listened to our Locked Up Living podcast. Feel free to mention this to your friends and to your colleagues, and give us feedback on our webpage lockeduplives.com and our Twitter account Locked Up Living. Many thanks too to Pete and Rach, who kindly allowed us to use their music. You Have Called Me Courage, and this is available from all the usual outlets.